So let's start to talk about the ways in which we use survey methodology to collect data about people's behavior, attitudes, knowledge, or other areas of information. When we talk about surveys, what we mean are any kind of paper and pencil, self-report methodology, interviews, polling techniques. All of those generally sort of use the same kinds of methodologies. And we're going to talk about the purpose and the types of surveys that exist and the best practices for question construction. So as I mentioned, there are generally three purposes for surveys. They can either collect data on attitudes, which includes your opinions, beliefs, or preferences about particular topics such as politics, religion, education, where do you think your tax dollars should go, should we have single payer healthcare systems, right? All these kinds of issues that come up all the time. And you'll see self-reported attitude surveys come out frequently about all of these topics and many others. In addition, we sometimes ask people about their behaviors. This might include what are they typically buying, who's making major buying decisions, their health behaviors, either their nutrition habits, their exercise habits, how often are they outside in the out of doors. Could also include their voting behaviors. So one of the things you could do is you can compare people's political attitudes with their actual voting behaviors. Lastly, we can actually use survey construction techniques to assess their knowledge of a topic. Of course, we do this all the time in classroom environments where we ask people about their knowledge of history, science, culture, other things that might be covered in a course. But in fact, actually using Google Forms, you can set up quiz-based questions, and Google Forms will give correct and incorrect answers using that methodology. And there's a video about how to do that actually that's posted in Canvas. One of the things that you need to do in your questionnaire is you need to explain the purpose of the survey and give them clear instructions. Let's try that again. One of the things you got to do is you have to explain the purpose of the survey and include clear directions about how to complete the survey. It is easy for participants to get confused about the kinds of things you expect them to do, especially if you are trying to ask them about their most recent behaviors or habits, such as eating or sleeping or how much stress they're under. You probably want to give them an idea about what time frame you're interested in. Do you want to know about their sleep habits in the last 2 days, the last 24 hours, the last 7 days, the last 6 months? And you might think through some of the problems that would occur based on those different time frames and what that would give you. Lastly, we need to always include demographic items. These are required actually in any sort of grant that's funded by state or federal monies has to include information to make sure that you're collecting from a diverse audience. At a minimum, we will always collect information on gender, age, and race ethnicity. But in addition, you might include things about sexual orientation or their political preference or their handedness or any other thing that you might be interested in, such as do they have children or are they married or in a relationship, depending on the kind of survey you're constructing. Let's take a look at some different kinds of questions. There are 5 general categories of question types. There's open-ended questions, which allow you to ask almost anything and often are the easiest to construct, but the hardest to analyze later on, right? Because then you got to figure out how are you going to categorize different responses. If you're not quite sure what your participants are going to answer, or you don't have a particular hypothesis yet, you're just sort of in the exploration phase, you might use open-ended questions to try to get at some of that. This is what focus groups do, right? Where a small group of people comes together and is asked about a topic, and their answers actually build off of one another. You can imagine this is not good for hypothesis testing about single individuals, but it might be a starting point to get some information if you're not quite sure what to expect. You could also combine open-ended questions, though, with things like forced choice questions, where they are forced to choose between 2 options, for example. The simplest kinds of these are yes-no questions or true-false questions, but there's some examples in the textbook also. If you're going to use forced choice, be aware that generally participants might have an acquiescence effect, which means once they've answered yes to something, they're more likely to answer yes to other things all the way down the line. And it might be hard to know whether or not participants are actually answering truthfully, or are they just answering yes because it's easy and they're bored with the survey, or they're not interested and not motivated. Third are multiple choice questions where we can assess their knowledge of a topic. The only problem with these is you've got to make sure that you know what the right answer is. You've got to make sure that your questions are very clear, that there's no confusion in the wording or what you're asking. The more common ones, the ones that you'll see here and the ones that we've already used in the class, are Likert type or Likert scale questions, where you give people a number that they agree or disagree with, and then you give them a 1, 3, 5, 7, or 9-point scale or something like that. And a related idea is a semantic differential scale, which you'll see right here at the bottom of the page. You give them a list of descriptors, and then they have to mark on which side of this descriptors, do they think it's easy or hard, helpful or useless, confusing or crystal clear. This might be useful actually if you're trying to get information, for example, about your survey in the first place. You should always be careful thinking about defining what you want to measure, right? Be very clear with a hypothesis about what you're looking for. It'll help you in designing your questions. Don't ask questions about health behaviors if actually what you really want to know is about their attitudes towards nutrition and exercise. You should use simple, concrete terms that are very specific to your hypothesis. If you ask about stress, you should be very clear. Are you talking about physical stress? Are you talking about emotional stress? Are you talking about stress from school or work? Those kinds of things will make a difference based on the population you're surveying. Avoid technical terminology or slang that your participants might not know. You don't use abbreviations unless you're sure that all of your participants know them. And you'd be surprised at how often sometimes participants don't know things. Also note that you might use biased terms that might drive your answers in one way or another. Sometimes it's hard to avoid biased terms. What you might use is two sets of questions that sort of represent opposite ends of the bias to see if that affects your participants' answers, for example, if you were looking for bias. You should be careful about multiple part questions. Those are called double-barreled questions, and I'll show you an example in just a second where you ask two things in the same question because your participants then won't know which one they're supposed to answer more importantly. And then you should think about the literacy of your participants. If you're going to question children and they don't know how to read, you might need to use pictures. Right? A student a few years ago was interested in understanding what kinds of snacks children preferred, but we weren't allowed to feed the children, of course, because of issues about them getting sick or having food allergies. What the student did was made a laminated card that had 4 food items on it, and the kids just had to point to which one they liked more or less. Here's some examples of questions, both good and bad. I'm sure as you look at these, you can see ways in which you might improve them. I check my partner's social media often. You can see here there's some overlap in the timing, right? Once a day and 1 to 3 times a day. Participants might want to mark both of these. 3 to 5 times a day overlaps with 1 to 3, and 5 plus and 3 to 5 also overlap. So make sure that you don't, that you're very clear about what numbers you need and make sure that there's a distinction between them. Also don't skip numbers. Don't do once a day and then 3 or more times a day, skipping twice a day. The other thing is your participants probably don't know how often they're checking their partner's social media. So you actually might do something like often, not at all, rarely, never, because they probably actually don't have a physical number in mind. What kinds of physical affections you show in public? In this case, it's a multiple choice, which only allows participants to mark 1. If you use a checkbox, you'll know it's a checkbox in Google Forms because it has a square instead of a circle and the radio button here on the side. This would allow your participants to mark all of them, for example. My partner and I have a lot in common. These are multiple choice questions. What I would encourage you to do instead is what's called a scale question in Google Forms. You can take a look at how to do those. I think the video goes over that. In that case, rather than it being the words strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, and agree, it's actually entered into your data form as numbers, which makes it easier to analyze later. I do like that these two questions are in opposite directions, right? My partner and I have a lot in common. My partner and I have nothing in common. Hopefully your participants' answers should line up in opposite directions, right? They should say strongly agree. Maybe we have a lot in common. And then they might mark strongly disagree. My partner and I have nothing in common, hopefully. If not, right, if there's a big difference in these, that tells you that maybe your participants are not actually taking your survey seriously and are not answering your questions. Here's another set of them. So these are scale questions I was just talking about. You can see it gives you a number from 1 to 9. How often do you spend time with your significant other? How often do you tell your significant other that you love them? How often does your significant other tell you that they love you? So this is, and the advantage of this is you've got a variety of things you're asking about relationships, and you get easy numbers at the other end. The need to feel wanted while in a relationship. Public affection is important. Could you be in a long-distance relationship? When you start to change the descriptors here on the side, very low, very high, not at all, very important, never, of course, you're going to start to confuse your participants about what you're looking for. You should try to use the same descriptors and scale questions on each side. You should make sure that you've checked the grammar and the spelling and clarity in all of your questions. You should give it to somebody else to read, to pilot out first and give you feedback. That's part of the reason we often do these group projects, to avoid making mistakes in surveys. I was mentioning earlier these 2-part or double-barreled questions. do you and I think it's supposed to be your significant other get along and work together? So what if you physically work together but you don't get along? Again, this is a forced choice, yes, no, and sometimes. If you're going to do this, if you're going to use forced choice, just give them two options. Otherwise, you should make it a scale question because you're going to start to get confused answers and not be sure what to do about them. Never collect email addresses, please. When you ask questions about age, as we've talked about previously, this is going to get some bias in participants that are worried about their age or the appearance of their age. So you should say, what age are you, rather than how old are you? Are you in a relationship? Again, be very clear about what you're asking. Do you want to know if they're dating? Are they in a consensual non-monogamous relationship? Are they married? Are they divorced? Are they widowed? Think about the kinds of things and the kind of data you want when you're constructing your questions. Okay. Some of the biases that you might see in surveys include things like the social desirability effect, that your participants actually often want to help you, especially in a class like this where they know this is part of your project. They're interested in trying to confirm your hypothesis. Generally, participants are nice and friendly, and they want to help you to get the answers you're looking for. So what that means is, though, if they can guess your hypothesis, they may give you the answers you expect, which is actually not what you want, because it doesn't tell you whether or not they actually were truthful in answering the questions. The other problem you may have, though, is when you're asking things about socially uncomfortable topics. Racism, sexism, cheating on tests. They may actually give you false answers because they don't want to tell you the truth. The other thing you may find, though, is in controversial questions like things about sexism or racism or cheating, is that your participants actually don't want to choose the extreme ends. They don't want to admit that there's no racism. They don't want to say that there's a lot of racism or that they're racist, but they also don't want to say that they're not racist at all because they think you're going to know that they're lying. So they might give you these middle scores to say, I'm neutral about this issue. If you ask about political issues related to elections, or political party affiliation or voting behavior, right? This is what happened in the 2016 presidential election. Lots of participants did not want to admit that they were thinking about voting for Donald Trump because they felt like it was socially undesirable. So they generally either avoided the question or put something else in its place. One of the things you can do to avoid fence sitting is you can actually remove the middle score in Likert scale questions. So we were talking about having a 1 to 5 or 1 to 9 point scale. That gives you a middle ground. If you want to avoid fence sitting, what you might do is use an even number of options. 1 to 4, 1 to 6, 1 to 8. That can avoid and reduce some of that fence sitting and makes them choose one side or another. Lastly is that researchers sometimes might note down or interpret information in a biased way. For example, in interviews, they might actually alter the behavior of their participants. These interviewer distortion or subversion effects is when you interpret or note down information in a way that confirms to your hypothesis, but maybe doesn't actually truthfully answer what the participants are thinking or talking about. Let me know if you have any questions. Have a great week.